Welcome back, everyone. On today's episode of Mind Matters, we're going to be discussing horror, terror, everything scary, because it's Halloween. It's that time of year, so we've got to do it.
There's no other
And there's
choice.
No other choice.
The show just sort of presented itself to us. We had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, sometimes it's just fate. And it's that time of year. So, well, why is stuff scary? Like, why do we get scared or why do we go to horror movies, for instance? It's like, what's the attraction there? Why do we like monsters?
Yeah, like what is it about horror that, that's not just like some biochemical thing, but there's definitely aspects to horror that keep popping up, bad decisions, really bad decisions that people make that lead to absolute catastrophe. Like don't open that door. Don't go into the cellar by yourself. Don't split up. Don't trip when you're running away from the serial killer and then just fumble around on the ground. But there's more to it too, but there's a lot of morals. I don't know.
Well, I guess you'd call them lessons in some way. It's because, there are some horror movies, for instance, that deal with natural phenomena. Whether it's some kind of natural catastrophe or even Jaws, right, with a great, giant shark.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a difference between what you'd classify as horror or thrillers or something like that, and like a nature documentary that might be equally horrible in some ways, but it's not scary, right? It's not scary in the same way.
No.
It seems to be that the scary things have to do with some kind of threat, almost like a predatory threat that is part of the realm of the unknown, and the not just the unknown, but it's the unknown that creeps into your life and then confronts you with a potentially life-destroying element, right?
Yes.
So whether that's in the thriller and horror movies dealing with like the rampaging killer or the methodical serial killer, or the kind of paranormal aspects of this supernatural threat, something that's really even further outside of the bounds of normality, that intrudes upon your life and you don't know what it is. It's part of the unknown, and it's at least in these movies and in some like real life experiences, as we'll see, it is a menace. So there's that element of predatoriness and of the unknown, because once you know what it is, that kind of deflates the threat of it. Like imagine having this. Well, this has happened a lot, I'm sure, in people's lives where something threatening happens. It's like you think your house might be haunted, for instance, because you're hearing these noises, and then you realize, there's some animal on the other side of your wall that's just, knocking on it or scratching at it. It's like, oh, well, why was I scared of that? It's not scary anymore once you know what it is, but it still would be scary if you found out what it was and it was something totally out of the ordinary, right? So that there's that out of the ordinariness that continues to be scary, even when you do know about it.
Yes, because as you were saying, Harrison, I mean, the fear of those things that are outside of the realm of normal day-to-day living in reality, once you do come to understand that those things that are around us and exist in our world, that we may get inklings of in books or movies or tales told by people who had experienced certain things, we realize or are reminded of the fact that there are things that are horrifying that exist in this world. And that even once you do come to know or have knowledge of them, in some instances, at least for me, they become even more horrifying because then the question becomes, how might I deal with such a horror if I had to confront it or be in the experience of knowing it directly as opposed to second or third hand. Today we wanted to talk a little bit about our first, second, and third hand experiences of those things that we find horrific, that scare the crap out of us.
In a click-worthy top 5 scariest things format, right?
Yes, because we want your clicks.
We want your smash likes. We want your... No, what are they called? What's that button called? The
hit smash like
the
button?
hit smash. We want your hit smashes. We want your hit smashes on those buttons.
Yeah. But the other point to this, in addition to gaining your hit smashes, certainly, is to get to the nitty-gritty here on this most intrinsic human experience that we have, certainly, as much as we can do here at MindMatters. And like you were saying, Corey, why do we seek out these films and books that we know or that are designed to scare us?
Why subject ourselves to these tortures?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I'd say at least one element is because probably for most of our time on Earth, life has been pretty, terrifying. It's probably in our genes to be terrified at, just the sheer immense potential for absolute catastrophe and doom, whether it's like a neighboring tribe coming and slaughtering, your village, or it's something like an authoritarian government, or the spooky stuff that still exists out there, and you're just like the unexplained kind of things that just pop in and out of the world, like it's just this big haunted globe that that we live on, and that it's, I guess, in horror kind of helps you to wrap your mind around it. It helps you to kind of incorporate it into your conscious, psyche, I guess, if you for lack of a better.
Yeah, because if horror and the things that scare are in that realm of like that boundary between and beyond like the known and the unknown, if that's where these things reside, then I guess in a sense the more you expose yourself to those things, like in manageable doses, perhaps maybe the more resistance you get, the more kind of like immunized you get to that sort of thing. Because I think back to all the things that used to scare me as a child, and the natural progression from that is that, well, most of those things, probably all of them, don't scare me anymore. Like being afraid of the dark as a kid, that's not really a thing for me anymore. And even some of the movies and things that terrified me as a kid, I can watch them now and just kind of chuckle because they're not scary anymore. Like maybe we can talk about some childhood experiences first, but
I'd like to. And I was saving this question for you guys for later on in the show. But I think I want to ask you now, because you just said that, Harrison. You just said that having these doses of horror in our lives through this exposure to films and other things can be a type of immunization in the way that it creates awareness of certain things, certainly. But in my observation of reading and watching certain things, you know how you have that kind of tingling in the back of your neck and goose flesh, and you become extra kind of sensitized to certain horrific things, which could be your imagination running off with you, or it could be, I'm wondering, a true sensitization. I'm not pronouncing that word correctly, but you get where I'm going with this?
Give an example. Like, do you mean like, because the first thing that came to mind is like after watching a really scary movie, then being kind of hyper aware of the things going on and wondering if every little creak and groan in the house is something scary. Like what situation are you talking about?
Well, in particular, and maybe now would be a good time to launch into personal childhood experience. I was thinking of my feelings, and after reading this book,
Okay.
which is a kind of a bio of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were a couple of investigators, paranormal investigators. The Conjuring movies are based on their experiences.
For everyone just listening, the book is The Demonologist.
Yes, thank you. The Demonologist by Gerald Brittle. And during and after reading it, I would just have to stop at some points, get out of my bed and get my bearings, and felt, again, it could be imagination, but I felt like I was more, I don't want to say vulnerable, but certainly, I don't know if it's just heightened awareness or if it feels like, my question is, when your mind goes in these directions, does it create, does it have a way of drawing them in?
When you stare into the abyss stares back. Maybe.
That's actually good. That's actually very apt, I think, because in a way, it's like, okay, you're aware of us, we're aware of you now, being aware of us. Mm-hmm. Well, that makes a certain amount of sense, Corey. Thank you for that. That very quick kind of,
Yeah, okay, next topic. No.
Yeah.
Next caller.
Well,
Well,
were you
maybe
going to say something?
no. Maybe we'll get into that as we go on, because I think that's a tough question. I'd say, like, in certain cases, no. In other cases, perhaps yes. So I'll be more wishy-washy about it. Well, in the cases with no, it's like with the example of like true crime and reading about things like psychopathy and the kind of malevolent people that you probably will come into contact with if you haven't already in your life. The more you know about it, I'd say the better chances you have of dealing with it and perhaps avoiding certain situations. If you recognize the signs early, you can get out of a situation that without that knowledge you would just run headlong into, to the point where you probably can't extricate yourself from it. So I think in certain cases like that, there is a protective element to exposing yourself to things of this sort. Whereas perhaps with others, and now this might come down to your motivations and the intentions you have looking at these sorts of things, because I think that a lot of people can kind of get almost a type of fetish for the sick and twisted. Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's probably a scale of reactions from the people that just avoid it completely because they don't want that kind of stuff in their mind. They don't even want to think about it, to those who are kind of intrigued by it, and I think that's why a lot of people watch like true crime documentaries and TV shows and things like that, or just horror movies. But then you get the people who are kind of obsessed with that kind of thing. And then on top of that, you get the people that, how to put it? Well, like the serial killers themselves, who actually really enjoy that kind of thing. And maybe in that one end of the spectrum, there's an element of the more you expose yourself to this, the more you embrace it and open yourself up to it. And I'm thinking about, for example, like people who get into like black magic and weird kind of rituals and things like that. Like, what's his name? The JPL guy who was into doing all kinds of weird rituals in the desert to like,
Alan Parsons.
Yeah, something like Jack Parsons.
Jack Parsons.
Yeah. Well, Alan Parsons, wasn't he the musician?
Alan Parsons
Yeah.
Band.
Yeah, Project. Yeah, like Aleister Crowley and stuff like that, where there's this element of really kind of wanting to invite that stuff into your life,
Right.
as opposed to reading about it, having like a visceral reaction to it, and the way that you'd study something like a poisonous snake before going on or a variety of poisonous snakes before going on a hike. Like maybe there are some people that would, well, the analogy would be studying those snakes because you identify with them and, maybe want to try out the venom on yourself or do some kind of weird thing with that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a whole spectrum of reactions and intentions behind that sort of thing. Like I think I knew a few people who were really into horror movies, as a kid, as a teenager, who really enjoyed watching the most horrendous things possible. Like what you'd probably call torture porn these days, like the worse the better, which is kind of a weird thing, but I think there's an element of that. And for me personally, I've never liked that kind of horror movie, for instance. Like I want the stuff that I somewhat enjoy watching are just the things that are more scary or creepy, not necessarily the stuff that just is there to gross you out. Mm-hmm. So, but then that creepiness, I think the creepy bits are the bits that even then that a lot of people are attracted to for perhaps strange and unknowable reasons. That's part of the creepiness of the whole subject matter is that there are individuals for whom these things are enticing in a way that most people couldn't understand. This goes back to our discussion of like Israel Keyes when we were talking about serial killers and how you take a book like Mindhunter or what was the other one that he read, Dark Dreams or something like that, where most people who read those books are reading them for educational purposes or for professional purposes if you're actually getting into law enforcement or like profiling or something like that. For Israel Keyes, it was more like
an education,
a reflection in the mirror. Here are these people like me. Oh, that explains the way I am, and I can learn from this on how to be a better serial killer. So,
well, yeah, that's one interesting thing. I was listening to an interview with, I think his name's, is it Dean Ruskin? Dean Ruskell? He was the original Mindhunter. And they based the series off of him. He was the guy who went and developed the whole behavioral unit for the FBI. I can't remember what his name was, but he said that the serial killers really enjoyed talking to him because when he got really good, he could tell them why they were the way they were, and he was like the only normal person who knew them better than they did. Which is, I think one reason why people like Israel Keyes will read that, so they get, some insight, and then also they get an idea of what, everyone else is thinking and how to, be 5 steps ahead of them.
Mm. Well, maybe we can get back to that. Let's get on to our number 5. We're not quite sure what number 5 will be yet. It's an exploratory process. But maybe we can start with some of the childhood things that scared us. I'll just give some examples. This will maybe lead into the real scary stuff, but I remember when I was a kid, there were probably three things that scared me the most as a young kid into probably early teens. The first one I can remember is The Last Crusade, Indiana Jones. Not a scary movie, but at the end, when Indiana Jones gets to the chalice, like the Holy Grail, there's that knight there that's guarding it, right? And the baddie, the bad guy, chooses poorly. He grabs the wrong chalice and he drinks from it, and then he starts disintegrating. And so here's the image that haunted me as a child. I remember watching this movie. I loved the movie, so I'd watch it over and over again, but at that certain age, until I got a bit older, I'd always run out of the room for that scene because it terrified me so much. So I'd run out of the room and I'd kind of peek around the doorway to watch when it was over. But I never got nightmares about it. It was just something I didn't like looking at. I think it was just too gross. The thing that gave me nightmares was Ghostbusters. Not the ghosts, but the terror dogs in the first film. So there are those like gargoyles, right? Those dogs that come to life, and they're these scaly beasts. I think we've got a picture of that, right? Yeah, it's up. So I had nightmares about these dogs I can't remember for sure, but it must have been maybe up to 2 years, maybe longer. It was a recurring nightmare that I had as a kid, and I can still picture it visually. So this is a nightmare that I probably had more than 20 years ago, like 25 years ago, and I can still vividly remember at least one of those dreams. I think they've all kind of, I've forgotten most of the variations, but I still remember the one. And usually it was these dogs, these giant, slavering beasts, and chasing me. And then from that point, like, it was a pretty common dream, the feeling of being chased, and then, you know, when you're trying to run and your body just won't move very fast, so you're moving at less than walking speed, and you're trying to run, and you look behind and the dog's gaining on you. And I had that dream just repeatedly for years. And I think I only saw the movie like twice, but it stuck with me forever. And now I watched that movie again just a couple of years ago, and well, I think it's hilarious, and funny, and just a great movie. Of course, not very scary, so again, the second thing that, for whatever reason, was just really scary, and then stuck with me for years afterwards.
Well, I would just posit that, like, you trace back the chase dream to the devil dogs in Ghostbusters. And I've had chase dreams too, where that felt like they went on for hours, that they were relentless, that I was being attacked and pursued by something. And I've had a few of them. I had one in particular that felt like it went on. I mean, it's visceral. It's almost as though you don't have that distance you might otherwise experience in a dream where things just happen. You're an active participant in running away from this thing. So, and I've heard about other folks having dreams that they felt like they were attacked, and so I think it's there's something maybe kind of archetypical about that devil dog.
Yeah.
In Ghostbusters that triggered something, or that you assigned to that imagery in Ghostbusters, but that really was part of another something in your psyche, in your experience.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty good representation of just the ultimate hunting predator, because it's not a canine companion. It is an exaggerated, almost demonic dragon-like. I'm thinking of the Chinese like cat dragons, or I'm not even sure if that was just Chinese lions, for instance, like that you'll see in Chinatown, or these giant dog-like creatures, dog-like, cat-like creatures, but in this demonic form that are hunting and preying on hunting its prey is just essentially, and that of course is a universal for humans, just being the weak, vulnerable creatures that we are in an environment that is just full of predators. It makes sense that for whatever reason my child psyche latched onto that image as the one to represent that whole class of beings. It's like what does Jordan Peterson? Well, he quotes some researcher. It's the dragon or the snake lion something tree. Yeah. It's like all of the super predators all combined into one that humanity has faced for hundreds of thousands of years. But then the one more from my childhood that was the scariest. I watched X-Files. Like, my whole family would watch it every week. And I remember I can't remember what year it came out, but this was in season 4, I believe. It was the episode Home with the Peacock family. And let's get them up on the screen. So, warning. So this was the scariest episode of The X-Files that probably there ever was. And while I don't think I had nightmares from it, it was another one of those experiences that's just stuck with me. And I'm pretty sure I did watch this one again, older, maybe in the past few years. And it was pretty frightening even watching it now. Did you guys ever watch The X-Files? Do you remember this one? It's the one where Mulder and Scully get called out to this house, basically, where something happened. They're trying to investigate, and there's this family that lives there that are just, they're monstrous because all of the children and probably the parents too, they're all products of incest, and the house takes place mostly at night, and they keep the mother on this like trolley underneath the bed, and they've got booby traps all set up, and it is a horror episode, really. And after they aired that episode, Fox told the producers that the Peacock family cannot appear on air again. It's like that. Okay, you had the one. we regret letting you guys do this, so you're not doing it anymore. And it's understandable because I think my whole family was freaked out by that episode, and that I think is one that like I said, it's even scary today after watching it then. I can't say that about many things that scared me as a kid. But I mean, what about you guys? Was there anything that you saw or experienced as a kid that still scares you today?
Yes. Well, to perhaps a lesser degree than it did when I was a kid. But when I was about 8 years old, a friend of mine had told me about this movie he had gone to see with his family called the Amityville Horror. So he was describing, what had happened, and this was a haunted house, and it's a true story. And the father was being driven to kill the family, and this was based on a story that was about a real place in Amityville, a real house that was only a few hours from where I lived. And the movie was based on a very successful book, and this was in the mid to late 70s. And I didn't even see the movie, and just the ideas that he was conveying to me about this scared the crap out of me. So for months, I was wrestling with all these, these things that really happened at the house in Amityville, and finally, I told my parents, I was really scared, and they told me that it was in fact a proved hoax. The whole thing was a hoax. There were articles in the New York Times about, the idea that nothing really ever happened there. And they were very upset that I'd been upset by this stupid friend who had told me about this movie that scared the crap out of me, that I'd never even seen. So, and after that, I never really followed up on the story of the Amityville Horror. Maybe I saw the movie at some point. I never read the book. And just a few years ago, as I mentioned a little earlier, I had read this book called The Demonologist, about the lives of Ed and Lorraine Warren. And they, for those of you who've never heard of them or who haven't seen the film, these people were the real thing. They would go places where they were requested to investigate hauntings and poltergeists and really, really kind of scary occurrences. But what they would also do is go to universities and churches and community centers, and they would educate people. They would share their experiences, sometimes with photos and recordings, and they would give people to understand that that the types of events that they had experience with were in fact real, even if they were sensationalized quite often, and that there were things, in fact, to be afraid of. Anyway, so I'm reading this book, and very early on in it, I'm just going to read a little bit from it because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the book, and it addresses the goings on in the Amityville house. So Ed Warren's office is located in a small cottage-sized building attached to the main house by a long enclosed passageway. As Ed sat working on preliminary details of the Amityville case, that fateful February morning, the latch at the end of the passageway snapped open, followed by the percussive boom of the heavy wooden door. Footsteps then started towards the office. Ed leaned back in his chair, waiting for Lorraine, his wife, to enter with a much-needed cup of coffee. "In here," Ed called out. Long moments passed, however, and she did not appear. "Lorraine?" Ed called out again, but there was no reply. When he heard instead, building in the distance, was an eerie howling wind. It was not the whistling of wind under the eaves, but rather the menacing roar of a distant cyclone. Gooseflesh rose on his arms. "Lorraine?" he asked forcefully. "Are you there?" But still there was no response. As the ominous swirling sound built in power and intensity, Ed quickly thought back over the last few moments. It then occurred to him that he had heard only 3 footsteps in the passageway, not the continuous tread of a person walking. Something was wrong. Suddenly, the desk lamp dimmed to the strength of a candle flame. Then, abruptly, the temperature in the office plunged to that of a walk-in freezer. A rank, pungent smell of sulfur rose in the room. Suspicious of the unnatural clamor, Ed Warren opened a desk drawer and withdrew a vial of holy water and a large wooden crucifix. He then got up and walked a few steps out of his office into the anteroom. As he did, there swirled out of the passageway a horrendous conical whirlwind. Pointed at the bottom, broad at the top, the thing was blacker than the natural blackness of the night. Far larger than a man, the swirling black mass moved into the dimly lit room and drifted slowly to Ed's left side and came to a halt some 10 feet away. As Ed watched, it appeared to grow even denser and blacker than it was before. Indeed, within the swirl, he could see that something was beginning to take shape. An entity was beginning to manifest in physical form. As a demonologist, Ed Warren knew he had to act quickly, to take the initiative before this fearsome black mass transferred itself into something even more forbidding and dangerous. Holding the cross toward what now was rapidly changing into a macabre hooded specter, Ed Warren stepped forward. The moment he did, however, the entity moved defiantly toward him. Ed stopped and stood his ground as the form slowly drifted forward. When the swirling black mass was no more than a few feet away, Ed methodically and with absolute determination showered the thing in the sign of the cross with the contents of the holy water vial. Then he spoke the ancient command. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave." For eternal seconds, the black mass stayed motionless, no more than a foot away from the cross. Then, slowly, it began to back off, though not before giving Ed a clear vision of himself and Lorraine involved in a potentially deadly automobile accident along a highway. With that, the entity withdrew into the passageway from whence it came. An enormous sense of relief came over Ed Warren as he stood, sweating profusely, in the freezing cold room. Yet as he attempted to collect his thoughts, the vicious snarl of fighting animals suddenly erupted outside the house. Immediately, Ed realized there was no animals fighting. The visitation was still in progress. The entity had simply moved upstairs to attack Lorraine. Avoiding the passageway, Ed flung open the door to the office and ran up the back steps of the house, he would be too late. Upstairs, Lorraine Warren sat in bed reading the biography of Pedro Pio, a remarkable Capuchin monk who many believe is destined for sainthood. In any case, the story goes on about this attack that the two of them received at the hands of this entity. And if you've heard interviews with them, and if you read the rest of the book, there's so much about that event that feels grounded in a type of reality that is just frightening to the core. And after reading it, I had one of these moments where I had to get up and take a breath and really compose myself, because something that they get into in the book is, they make the distinction between evil, human entities and evil non-human entities. And they account for many of the experiences that they've had with what they would call non-human entities that are extremely powerful, and that knew of them, and that wanted to scare them enough and hurt them enough to prevent them from doing investigating into what they were doing. And in this case, he was reviewing some notes about what had occurred in this house in Amityville. So it really kind of drove home for me something that Lorraine Warren says later on in the book, which is that the events as depicted in the movie, the Amityville Horror, and in the book, were actually much less than what had actually occurred there. That things were far, far more hellacious for the people, the Lutz family that moved out of there after a certain period of time. They were only there a short while. They had bought the house only a year or two after the previous owner killed his family in the house. So there was something very dark about that, and it was a very strange reminder of this fear I had as a kid.
Well, I think that we can say on our list, number 5, scariest thing ever, goes to the idea of the Amityville Horror, because that was a great story. I just wanted to point out one of the things I was thinking about while listening to that is your parents' remark and the newspaper articles talking about it and all of the debunking that regularly goes on about paranormal things. My kind of one-liner response to that sort of response is, I think that a lot of it's basically what adults tell themselves not to be afraid. And it's a very strong, I think, motivator for stupid adults, basically, to think they understand the world and think there's nothing scary about the world, because I think deep down they're just as scared, or they would be just as scared as they were when they were kids, if they were to accept that maybe there are a lot of weird and scary things that happen and that we don't really have a grasp of the totality of reality and the scary things that actually go on in it. So I think that's one of the reasons, that might also be one of the reasons why people gravitate to ghost stories and horror movies and things like that, is because I think there is a reality to all of this stuff. Even if we don't understand it in all its details, I think it's very arrogant and stupid for us to just deny it and to just think that reality is this mundane thing. Of course, even within that mundane reality, there are terrifying things that happen and that go on and that are out there. Even just within, you look at the monsters that are in human form, but there are things that are way scarier than that too. And maybe that'll lead into the kind of next category that I was thinking of. One of the other things that really scared me when I first encountered it, a nonfiction book written by John Keel. This is, well, two nonfiction books. One by John Keel, that was The Mothman Prophecies. And the second was a book by Bud Hopkins called Intruders. And this was, so the Intruders book was this book on alien abductions written in, I think, maybe late 80s or mid 80s. I think it might have been 87, I can't remember. And then Mothman Prophecies was John Keel's story about, probably most people have heard about Mothman because they made it into a movie in like late 90s, I think, with Richard Gere. Mm-hmm. I didn't find the movie very scary, but the book I found terrifying when I first read it. Again, I reread it in the last 5 years maybe, and I just found it really interesting, not really scary at all. But that book, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of weird paranormal things, it's got pretty much all of them. And I've read a lot of John Keel, and well, first of all, he's a great writer. He's really funny. And despite a lot of people who think he's just a hoaxer, I've read enough by him, about him, and kind of behind-the-scenes correspondence to know that he was actually a very serious guy. Despite his kind of gonzo personality and the way that he would write and the kind of image of himself that he projected, he was a serious researcher, and he was he had this motivation to get to the bottom of things, and that's one of those examples of the abyss staring back, because he wanted to get to the bottom of all this stuff, and in the process encountered all of it. and it resulted in first some very odd situations, second some very unnerving situations, and then third just some completely mind-boggling, unexplainable, and pretty terrifying situations and just things that happened to him. And some that weren't even very scary, but that were just odd and like weird, kind of like stepping into some kind of bizarro reality. And meanwhile, he's just still living his everyday mundane existence, but intruding in that existence is just all of this weirdness, all of this new strange reality. So I think, and then the second book was Bud Hopkins' Intruders. I've heard this from a lot of people, because I was reading a lot of, well, not a lot, but I started reading some stuff about UFOs and alien abductions and stuff when I was a teenager. And I'd tell my friends about it at the time, and I just remember telling them stories and about this stuff in these books, and the looks on their faces. It was as if I were telling them ghost stories around a campfire. Like the eyes got wide, and I remember one of my friends even telling me that how scared he was. He's like, "Oh man, if that stuff's real, that's so terrifying." I was like, "Yeah, isn't it? It's really scary." And again, if you look at the whole alien abduction narrative, the storyline, it is pretty terrifying. The message to take away from any of those books is you're not safe anywhere, and you have no control over your life. There are these beings that can insert themselves into your life at any given moment, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. And not only will the experience potentially be very frightening, but you might have like PTSD for the rest of your life or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so around this time, or no, probably before that, I watched the movie Fire in the Sky, which was the dramatization of the infamous Travis Walton experience. Mm-hmm. I think that happened in the 70s. I can't remember which year. Just a famous abduction experience. And I watched that movie alone in my basement at night. And do you have a... Yeah, I think we've got a screenshot from... Okay, yeah, we'll show the... Oh, I think there's another one with the alien in it. But there's a scene, yeah. It's really a bad movie, but it was terrifying at the time. Again, I watched it several years ago, and I realized what a bad movie it was and how it wasn't scary at all. But as a kid, at this point, I hadn't read anything about alien abductions. I don't even know why I wanted to see this movie, because I didn't know anything about it. But like X-Files, just terrified me. Like, don't think I had nightmares, but I was terrified for...
Well, there are some scary scenes in that movie.
Yeah, like when he... Well, the thing I didn't like about it watching it the second time is he gets taken to this UFO craft or something. It's not even clear where he is. It almost looks like he's on a different planet, like underground. It's all dirty and everything's... there's like layers of dust and grime on everything, and they're doing these medical procedures on him, and he wakes up in this kind of organic, kind of cocoon-like thing, and it's all really creepy. I didn't like it because I didn't like it later because it didn't. I don't think any of that was in the actual account. Like they just added that in for dramatic purposes, but it was kind of gross and creepy, and that's been the experience of pretty much anyone that I talked to who read anything about this or who watched like X-Files or watched this movie. On first encountering that idea, that thing, like alien abduction, it's always terrifying. And a lot of people then say they have nightmares about being abducted by aliens after that. And never happened to me, but again, it's this almost universal like fear that's associated with that topic. I know a lot of people that, of course, just write off the whole thing as some kind of hallucination or just hoax, which it definitely isn't. Well, there might be a huge element of hallucination or kind of hallucination in it, but I don't think that accounts for it all. And it's definitely not just hoaxes. There are thousands of people like this all over the planet who have had experiences like this, and there are psychiatrists and psychologists who at least take it seriously to find out at least what can be done to help these people because they have had these traumatic experiences, whatever the real nature of them is. But there's this almost universal reaction to the idea that is very fascinating. And so there's this, we can add that to like the category of really scary things. Like there are these human predators, like serial killers and raving madmen like you find in all the horror movies, which is scary. There's the natural predators that are scary, like Jaws. There are these supernatural demons that are scary. And then there are these like aliens that for whatever reason are scary. I mean, why are they scary? Because science fiction has been around for hundreds of years. And even just before that, kind of mythological, fantastical worlds and these kind of otherworldly beings, like the Greek gods or whatever, the gods from any culture. If you look at just science fiction, though, I mean, you watch Star Wars and Star Trek, and there's all these aliens, right? And they're not particularly scary. It's just here are a bunch of these other species that look kind of funky, and they're aliens. But something about the alien in modern like pop culture is frightening for some reason. And I don't really know why that is. Why would aliens, the aliens in the kind of X-Files shape and form, why should that be scary and like Jabba the Hutt shouldn't? What is it about that's actually frightening? I think part of it is that intrusiveness of the phenomenon as described by all of these people that have these experiences. It's the having no power over your life and being just seemingly at the whim of some being that you do not understand, that you probably can never understand, and that just introduces this element of terror and violation into your everyday life. Something that you can't understand and that you have no control over. Is probably why it's scary. I don't know.
Well, with Jabba the Hutt, you have somebody who's like physically there in presence, and I mean, he's just a big blob. I mean, like he might be like physically intimidating because he's just so big. But I mean, he has definite shape. He has definite form. He acts coherently for a logical purpose. But the popular conception of what we think of as aliens is very foreign to us in that they don't have necessarily definite shape or form. You read John Keel's work, and like the gray aliens thing isn't always the case. Like it changes depending on the person. It changes. So they don't have a definite form, and you don't know their intentions,
Right.
because you might think that it's one thing, but then all of a sudden, like these weird anomalies start coming up. Like again with John Keel, he'll be investigating something, and he's like, "Oh, I have this idea about what's going on," and then all of a sudden he gets phone calls saying like, "Yes, that's the thing that's going on," or whatever it is, and then he's like, "Well, that's weird. Like, how does anyone know what's going on in my head right now?" And so that throws out like time into this weird foreign conception that, like you say, is just so foreign that we have no way of containing it within our minds. And so that terrifies us, because if we can't get a hold on it in our own minds, then we're
Right.
completely at the whims of.
Well, I guess I have an experience that kind of falls into that realm, and it's, I mean, you just take it with a grain of salt, because I was young, 16 at the time, but it was I remember, I remember it like it was yesterday, because I was 16. My parents had been divorced for a while, and we had a small, like a family business, and I was like in charge of the shop. Well, my dad had a boat like an hour and a half away on a lake, and he was out for the weekend. And so I had the shop for the weekend, and that meant I had complete 16-year-old freedom, to do whatever I wanted. And so it was like a little paradise, So I went to hang out with my friends for the evening, and before I left, I hadn't even gone to the house yet, but I assumed everything was just quiet and tranquil at the house. And I got back, it must have been around 11 p.m. or midnight, and all of the lights were on in the house. And I was like, what the heck is going on here? This is strange. And I walk into the house, and the TV is on, and every radio in the house is on. And they're all playing these different, like, like different sounds and everything. So I was like, well, geez, like, was there some, in the back of my mind, I'm like, there must have been like a power outage. And then when the power came back on, everything else came back on or something. So, and we had a dog outside, and she was pretty chill. So I wasn't too worried about what was going on. So I went inside, and, I turn off everything, and I'm just kind of relaxing. I sit down in front of this window. There's a couch in front of an open window, cracked so that, fresh air comes into the house. And I sit down, and I'm just sitting there, and it sounds like the wind, right? At first it's the wind, but then all of a sudden the wind started to speak. Like there was like this very like audible, like foreign language that I'm hearing. And I'm like, all of a sudden I'm like, what the heck is that? and then I like kind of snap out of it. And then I heard what sounded like footsteps on the side of the house, 2 stories up, footsteps along the side of the house, and then on the roof. And I was like, oh my, I was like, well, guess it's time for bed. I'm out. So then I'm getting up, and I'm like, this, clearly it's like this strange, ominous thing is going on, and there's footsteps, and I'm like, all right, so what do I do now? I guess I was like, well, I could pretend like everything is normal, or I could get the heck out of here and just blaze down the highway as fast as I can. So I run out the side door, and on the side door, there's this big porch, and the porch wasn't finished, so there was a big gap underneath it. And I run out there, and my car is on, it's, down these steps from the porch to the lane to my car. And between me and my car is my dog, and this big gap underneath the porch. And my dog is just staring into the gap under the porch, growling, just a gnarly, gnarly growl, and I'm like, look. And so then I just step back, and then I just take a run for it and leap the distance onto the lawn, and then I run to my car, get in, and then drive off, and then come back a few hours later, and everything is fine. I mean, never had any other sort of strange experience like that again. So it's one of those things, like you said, there's no physicality to it. There was no like evidence of anything that had actually been, walking around on the roof. There wasn't damaged tiles. There wasn't, damage, on the roof. So like I said, you just take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, there's just that dimension of human life that's just weird.
Do you remember if all the lights and appliances were on when you got back there later?
No, they were. I think everything was off. Everything was back to normal. I think I waited a day though to come back. But then I was like, oh, that was the thing. When I left, I realized I left the furnace on. So I was like, oh no, this. It was a stove, like a propane fueled stove or something like that, gas. And I was like, well, the house is gonna burn down. I got to go back and get it. So I had to go back and turn it off, but everything was fine.
Wow, Corey,
It was just a weird experience.
That's pretty crazy, and it reminds me of an experience I've had when I was in my early 20s. That was weird in probably a different way, but really horrifying. Me and my family had just moved into a new apartment, and one night, a couple of weeks into this living there, I was, just as you're about to fall asleep and you're in that kind of middle zone, I'm in bed and I hear, the wall is right next to me, and I'm lying down, and just beyond the wall, I hear this, motherfucker, like that. Mm-hmm. Ongoing. So I spring awake because I'm like, what is that? And it went on and on. Stunning fucking dog. And it was like that. So I'm petrified because what it greatly reminded me of. I mean, in addition to just being awoken by this really loud, screaming female voice, just here, just like right next to me, just beyond the wall. I'm like wondering, what is that? I can't see it. I'm only hearing it, and it's like incredibly loud and disturbing and horrible, swearing. So my mind went to the granddaddy of all horror films in my mind, which kept me awake for many a night, The Exorcist. And if we have a picture of possessed Regan on, it's just a reminder of this truly almost traumatic movie that came out, I think in 72 or 73, William Friedkin's movie based on the book by Peter Blatty, about a young possessed woman, actually a young girl. Truly one of the most frightening experiences to be had in a movie ever, and something that this was a direct kind of, this experience of this crazy screaming was a direct kind of recalling of. And I later found out that we, in fact, had a neighbor who was mentally quite sick, schizophrenic, violently schizophrenic. And unfortunately, I had to endure this type of thing for years because it was a legal wrangle. She wasn't legally permitted to live there, but her mother lived there and would let her back in all the time. And where she chose to have her outbursts was in the bathroom just right next to my bedroom wall.
Oh, my gosh.
It was tough. But
Well, that is another terrifying thing, though, isn't it? Mental illness. That is terrifying.
yes, and raises the question in my mind now that I think about it of whether or not there was an element of possession involved there, or not. Mental illness can be quite damaging enough as it is. So I don't know, but
I think a good question with that is to ask whether or not something like that can be like, are you possessed by an archetype? Let's say, are you being a channel for some strange archetypal evil of a sort with mental illness? I mean, Joker style. Or is it an actual like conscious entity that's like, I'm gonna be fine with everybody?
well, I mean that raises a question in my mind. If such archetypes exist and manifest themselves in people who are mentally ill, it's just strange to me because, aside from the Amityville Horror that I mentioned earlier, The Exorcist, I think, and this is true of many people, there's been a lot written about it. This is a powerful movie that you really have to, I think, prepare yourself to see. It's not sensational in the way that a lot of horror is, precisely because a lot of the events in it are based on real things. So I do recommend it if you've never seen it before, but I would just say that one should be prepared because there have been a lot of stories around the making of The Exorcist and the weird things that have happened, and there are things that feel or seem to be metaphysically true because it's not only a movie about possession, it's a movie about the priests and the mother and all of the kind of wherewithal and inner strength they are required to muster in themselves in order to do this spiritual battle with evil on a very big level. And the priest has to see through the lies and be stalwart, just like Ed Warren in a lot of the experiences that he's had in supporting exorcisms and going places and dealing with things. There's almost a preternatural psychological knowledge that a lot of these demonic entities seem to have about the people that they're doing battle with. It's like they can go right into their minds and hearts and souls and find those things that are most vulnerable about them and attack. It's not just this kind of, it's not just scaring the living bejesus out of people and doing things chaotically willy-nilly. There's intelligence involved. And couple that with, wall splitting and things flying and feeling physically ill and physically pained by all of this induced evil, all of this malevolence that gets directed at you in the form of negative energy. I mean, there's a reality to this that is, well, I think it's good to know about it because like you were saying earlier, Harrison, after a time, even though I've never confronted anything directly, more directly than eventually telling her to shut the hell up, dealing with something like this is on a whole other level. But having some knowledge of it, I think, goes some way towards strengthening ourselves. And being wise enough not to do the types of things to ever invite these things into your environment, into your psyche, because they are powerful things that seek to control and harm. So that might be my that could go on the top 5 somewhere.
Well, I think
For me.
so. Number 4 could be aliens and demons. I think that's a good number 4.
Number 4. Just stay tuned for number 1.
Yeah, we'll get through the top 3 pretty quick. Well, these are in no particular order, I should just say. Just on the subject of your scary neighbor, it just reminded me of a freaky incident I had like that. Again, probably dealing with mental illness. Not quite as dramatic, but the image will always stay with me. I was working at a bookstore. This was in my early 20s. And so I was at the counter, and we had this guy come in. I think he'd probably been in a few times, so we recognized him and knew there was something off about him. So one of the other employees was in the back of the store just to kind of stay in proximity to him because we weren't sure if he might be stealing or something like that. And so the other employee was just reshelving some books, and I was watching, and so I could see both of them. There were some bookshelves in between, but I could see the employee looking at the bookshelf that he was working on, and then I could see the guy standing at the other end of the store, staring directly at the employee, and he just had this look on his face, like just this extremely focused but blank and kind of empty look on his face, and he was staring, and he was doing these hand movements, almost like
spells?
Yeah, so it looked like he was trying to perform some kind of spells or something and directing them at the back of this other employee's head.
God.
And I just looked at it for a second, and he didn't see me, but he just did it for a few seconds, and I was just like, "What the hell is going on?" And then he stopped and left the store eventually, and nothing weird happened. I'm pretty sure this was around the time when we came into the store one morning, and there was I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was almost, I think it was a homemade doll. I can't remember what it was made of, but it was left right outside the back door to our building, to the store. And it was just this creepy thing. We're like, okay, pick that up, put it in the trash, and then carry
It
on
never
with the
came
day.
back, did it?
No, it never came
Okay.
back. Thank God.
Okay.
But these two things happened around the same, around the same period of time, and just creepy experiences that I can't remember what the doll looked like, but the image of that guy just staring, mouth slightly open, doing these weird movements with his hand, directing them at this other guy was just, I'll always remember that just because I have no idea what was going through this guy's head.
Well, I'm just throwing this out there, but there's one story that the Warrens tell of being like in Manhattan, and Ed Warren being compelled to walk into this alleyway where he sees this homeless guy who's festering in rot, basically. He's living in garbage. He's got boils and just like festering. And what happens is this homeless guy speaks to Ed Warren like he knows him and says, "We're watching you," or words to that effect, which suggested this kind of non-local, almost puppet-like power that some beings have over individuals, kind of like in the Matrix, where the agents can step in and take over a body. And it's really the stuff of horror films. And so when you were describing this blank staring guy doing this kind of spell binding with his fingers, it's like mental illness. Yeah, most probably, maybe, but
something else too.
But maybe something else too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how are we doing on time? This is
About an hour 10.
okay. Let's really quickly. Top 3. No. Well, maybe just really quickly. Let's talk about some horror movies for the Halloween. Let's get in some Halloween spirit for if you maybe want to check out some films this Halloween season to get scared about. Again, if you don't like scary movies, then don't watch any of these movies because they're scary. what I think there are a couple movies that kind of stick out in my mind, kind of classics that are still have some scare value to them. I've seen The Shining probably a dozen times, and I don't really find it scary anymore. But it is a genuinely creepy movie. I remember being pretty freaked out the first time I saw that. One other old movie that has to get a mention is Silence of the Lambs. Getting into the kind of more thriller genre. So this would be like the dramatization of what would otherwise be true crime. So serial killers, strange, scary villains and murders and that kind of thing. But there's this scene in Silence of the Lambs. This is the one that stuck out for me, and it still freaks me out to this day, is the scene near the end where Clarice is basically going into the house and enters a room and it's pitch black, right? And she's got her gun out. And she doesn't know, but the viewer knows that the guy is in the room with her and has these night vision goggles on. So you see things from his perspective. And go to the other one for a sec. I'll explain this one first. So at one point, he basically reaches out his hand, and he's right in front of her. He's about to touch her, and she has no idea. And like leading up to that, of course, you see her stumbling around in the dark because they actually filmed this in the dark, so it's very realistic. She can't really tell where she's going. She can't see anything. It's pitch dark. And this guy is there watching her. It cuts back and forth between the almost like the green night vision and then just the really dark shadow where you can see the guy's face with these night vision goggles on. And of course it leads up to the kind of climactic shooting event. But just that idea, maybe this is kind of, I think, why kids are scared of the dark, and some adults, is because you don't know what's out there. And this scene was just expertly shot in it's such a frightening scenario. To be in the dark, to know that there's someone else with you and not to be able to see them, and on top of that, they can see you. Mm-hmm. And they can then toy with you and sneak up on you, do whatever they want, and you're kind of at their mercy.
They might as well be aliens.
Yeah.
Another movie that plays on a similar kind of theme is a new one that's Midsummer. It's from the producer, director, writer, probably all three, of Hereditary. And in this one, it's the premise, he describes it as a breakup movie. So just imagine the worst relationship you've ever had, with no communication, all passive aggressive, covert aggressive, no bonding, no substance to the relationship, and then amplify that times 1,000. And it's about some grad students who are going to Sweden on this trip. There, one is like an anthropologist, I think. Another is a psychologist. This girl, she has a catastrophe in her family, and so she goes along with her boyfriend on this trip, who is also, I think, an anthropologist, or he's getting his PhD, and he has to write a thesis. He's a kind of a lazy bum, so he doesn't know what his thesis is going to be about. And they go to Sweden to visit this once every 90 years, this commune holds this big festival. And of course, no one read the Yelp reviews on this commune before they went over there. So there was, they're all basically oblivious, and they are completely unaware of the kind of danger they're putting themselves in until it's completely too late. And even then, all of the danger that they're in is plausibly deniable, and is denied not just by the commune members themselves, but most of the people who are there, most of the grad students, they each of them develop some egotistical reason to just push all of the red flags to the side, sweep it all under the rug until the final breakup scene commences. But it was described the producer is basically a movie that's either going to disturb you to the core, or you're not even going to be really fazed by it, because it's not a horror, it's not a slasher, it's a psychological, it's a mind bender. You get into these characters and you see like every moral failing really that you could see, and sticking together, and all of the infighting, and it's so realistic, it's so well written, that you see the desperation that some of the guys have to finish their thesis so they can get their PhD, and they're willing to just sweep everything under the rug, all this weird stuff, and through just a limited use of violence, it just creates this aura of this ominous aura, combined with Hansel and Gretel imagery and beautiful music and beautiful scenery. It's one of those movies I would highly recommend if you are into horror movies in general, especially the psychological kind. But then watch it with somebody else and be prepared to take breaks.
Well, it sounds like part of the horror you were describing there is, induced through gaslighting, where, you're not quite sure of what the reality is, or you're pushing it aside, or you're subjecting someone else to your version of reality that doesn't jive with what's objectively occurring. And that would seem to have something in common with, the alien abduction scenarios that you were describing too, Harrison, where those things just don't happen, anal probes, that's as far as it gets, buddy, but no. And getting into the heads of a character who's dealing with the lies, or not dealing with the lies, but engaging the lies when the reality is staring at them in the face, where they're unable to acknowledge the danger. Put yourself right into the scenario, and can be very, very jarring. But along those lines, and getting back to some of the earlier questions that were posed at the top of the show, why do we like watching horror or thinking about it? And is there any value to it? Does it give us anything that's beneficial? So there is an article written by a Sigrun Danke Skar from the Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences, same part of the world as that movie. And what he says is that it allows us to feel anxious in a safe environment. The first of the three main reasons we like watching horror films is quite elementary. They entertain us. And then he goes on to say that personality tests reveal that those who are bored easily often score higher than others on a trait called sensation seeking, and that there are several studies that those who score high in regard to that trait show an increased liking of horror films. Thus, some people jump off mountains with parachutes, while others go to amusement parks to enjoy roller coaster rides. Horror film enthusiasts watch films. Another reason we are drawn to the darkest of film darkness is that the horror film is a way of unraveling evil. And he says, formerly religious explanations of evil are nowadays given a diagnosis. One subjects the evil actions to scientific or psychotherapeutic explanatory models, he says. We are familiar with the diagnosis from, for example, forensic psychiatry, where different psychosis or personality disorders are assessed from a psychological and social perspective. In society as a whole, little or no discussion revolves around evil anymore. We simply do not believe in the demonic as a force in itself, perhaps with the exception of some extremely religious environments. However, in popular culture, and especially in the world of film, evil is presented as an independent phenomena through the horror genre. Evil is reserved for this genre of popular culture because we no longer believe in the compelling explanatory models that the local priest once gave us. Ideas and myths like Frankenstein provide us with, for example, an explanation for human technological arrogance, where the man-made monster turns on its own creator. A third and last reason, which he addresses, is what he calls the anthropological and therapeutic utility of a horror film. It teaches us to deal with our own anxiety. This occurs partly through the familiar frameworks that are found in every proper genre film, including the horror film, and partly through the rituals we build around the viewing experience. We see it in the way teenage boys occasionally use horror films as part of a kind of manhood test, where it's about keeping one's composure as much as possible. In this perspective, the horror film becomes a way to test our personal and collective limits in a safe environment. If it gets too scary, you can just cover your ears, put your hands in front of your eyes, ease attention with an amusing quip, or turn to your popcorn bowl for comfort. In psychology, we call this activation of a feeling emotional regulation. By watching horror films, one can have a sense of control over both the situation or the viewing experience, and over the feelings of fear. Watching a scary film may possibly also function as a distraction from other feelings. And he also goes on to say, the term refers to how every psychologist Johnson also notes Sigmund Freud's term, das Unheimliche, the uncanny, as a common theme from horror films. The term refers to how everyday situations or objects suddenly seem to be ruled by unknown forces. Frightening. In several films by David Lynch and in the Twin Peaks series, it seems that this principle has been used almost directly. The horror film is one of the oldest film genres. Dating back to the silent film of the previous turn of the century, we have been dreadfully delighted with this particular type of film. So basically, you know, what this guy is saying is some of the things that we've been saying here today, that it's the extraordinary in the realm of the mundane that really gives us a fright. And you were saying earlier, Harrison, how, you know, you had friends of yours who in their teens would watch these films. Some of it really like gore porn, but I think a lot of it, you know, horror, kind of testing the limits of ourselves a little bit, and maybe there's a kind of a natural leaning towards or intuition that tells us that having horror in certain amount of doses is a kind of natural reminder of the world as it really exists, and that we shouldn't. We certainly shouldn't indulge in it. That can be unhealthy as well. But there can be something that is, you know, we don't grow and we're not healthy unless we're exposed to a certain amount of stress in our lives. And the horror genre, when it's done well, and if you're lucky enough to find a film that speaks to certain truths, can be a kind of a productive thing.
Yeah, like that description that he gave about using it to kind of almost as a method of emotional regulation. That's pretty much been my experience of watching movies like this. I hadn't actually thought about it in those terms, but that description seemed really accurate. Like when I watch, for instance, probably my favorite horror movie of recent years is Hereditary. And but with any kind of movie like that, I'm constantly watching my own reaction to what I'm watching at the same time. So when there's a bit of suspense leading up to what might be a jump scare or just a situation that you're not sure what direction it's going to, I'm always checking back at myself and kind of being slightly amused at the fact that I'm having this funny reaction to what I'm watching. And there is almost an element of, okay, well, can I get through this? You know, without covering my ears and shutting my eyes like I did when I was a kid. and it's almost kind of like an exercise when I'm watching a movie like this to see what I find scary and what the emotion, what the flavor of that emotion is that it provokes, and then afterwards to kind of reflect on it and think like, well, why was that scary, and how were they doing it? Like, what were they doing within the scene to actually make it scary? Kind of like with the Silence of the Lambs thing. There are a few scenes in Hereditary where there are these just kind of subliminal tricks that Ari Aster is playing on the viewer, where you don't necessarily notice them at first. There were similar things going on. Well, any good horror movie has these subliminal kind of things to get you scared. Like in Shining, the set was deliberately designed to be nonsensical, like hallways leading nowhere, and to kind of to unconsciously make you feel as if you're in a maze, like at the end of the film. And in I think it was the show Haunting of Hill House, the Netflix series, there were some scenes like that where, if you notice in certain scenes, there's an actor off in the distance behind the camera dressed up as like this ghostly figure that's being reflected in the glass behind this just ordinary scene. And if you don't notice it, you might just be kind of slightly creeped out and you don't know why. And if you actually notice it, it's like, well, that's pretty creepy. What is that strange ghostly creature like there? And they do the same thing in Hereditary, where there are a few scenes where there's just this kind of ghostly nude figure standing in the background that you may or may not notice, and eventually that becomes significant, in a later scene. Or there's this one scene, it's in the dark, and it's in a bedroom. So again, the kind of archetypal scary scenario, something bad happening in your bedroom where you're totally vulnerable. But if you look closely in the shadows, there's a character, I won't reveal who, that's basically clinging to the top of the ceiling in the corner. You can see it circled here. And you don't really notice it, but then in the shadow, this character crawls across the ceiling and goes out the door. And when I watched it with some people didn't notice it when it happened. I guess I was just looking at the right part of the frame when it happened, so I noticed it the first time. But noticing it is actually probably scarier than not. But so there are tricks that can be used that are there for a purpose. It's to scare you. Like, that's why these people are making these movies. Partly is to make it scary. And so maybe next time you watch a horror movie, try to pay attention to all these things at the same time. Like the film itself, your reactions to it. Try to gauge your own level of reaction and what kind of your limits are. There are some times where, well, not for scary stuff for me, but there are times where I feel the urge to close my eyes just because there's something I don't necessarily want to look at. But also pay attention to what the tricks are. How have all the decisions that these actors and directors of photography and directors, how have all their decisions in these scenes come together to scare you? What is it that they're doing to make you frightened? And I don't know, I don't know if it's helpful in the real world or not. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I just know that sometimes when it's dark and I see a shadowy figure, I still kind of get freaked out. But maybe through all the scary movies that I've watched, I'm not as freaked out as I would be otherwise. I don't know. Maybe not. But since we've run on for long enough, we should nail down our top 3 on this list. Maybe we should split up number 4, aliens and demons. They can each get their own category. So we got 5, the idea of Amityville horror. 4, aliens. 3, demons. 2, maybe we can add serial killers to there. And then our number 1. Maybe we can just end with each of our favorite scary movies. So I just said mine. I think mine's probably, well, Shining, or for new ones, Hereditary. What about you guys?
Oh, I'd definitely going with Midsummer. That's my favorite one that has recently come out. I used to really like horror movies. I used to enjoy them quite a bit, but I had so many nightmares. no, but it's just over time. I fell out of love with them, for whatever reason, and still Aliens has still got to be up there because that bugger has been in my nightmares he was in my nightmares for years. but yeah, I think that whatever I wanted to get out of horror movies, I got out of them. And Midsummer presented something far more intriguing, interesting, psychologically challenging that required 2 viewings to really digest. Before I, really got the moral out of the story and was able to watch it with, just kind of with that sense of like you're not scared anymore. Now you're like, oh, okay, so now this is why that happened. That's why this happened. And you start, like you said, you start to see how they put all these pieces together. And like you said, Harrison, I think it's good practice for just emotional regulation. Watching a horror movie and just regulating your emotions. Really, that's probably one of the biggest reasons why we do watch them, right? It's because it's nice to...
Yeah, and it's a bit entertaining at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'll just say that I'm looking forward to seeing Hereditary and Midsummer sometime soon, so I appreciate the recommendations.
Yes, we'll watch them.
But just getting back to what was mentioned earlier, certainly The Exorcist, which I have no plans on rewatching. And I really enjoyed The Conjuring of a few years ago.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Which did have its element of possession and poltergeist and really scary things going on, but also was an affirmation of love and the love of Ed and Lorraine Warren for a family that they were trying to help, and a love of a family that was trying to together deal with some very, very disturbing events. So it had a point, and that point is that all of this really shocking evil, whether it comes in the form of demons or aliens or psychopathic serial killers, should include a kind of psychological or the beginnings of a psychological response in your own mind, in your own being, and in order to help mitigate that situation, should it ever, God forbid, enter your experience.
And we can't forget horror comedy either, because that is by far my favorite genre of movie. So if you want, check out Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, because that's the funniest horror comedy I've seen. Shaun of the Dead. Yeah, that's check out Tucker and Dale vs.
Evil Dead
if you
2.
haven't seen it. If you want something lighthearted and not as heavy.
Army of Darkness.
Army of Darkness. Oh, Bruce Campbell. Yeah, great stuff.
Yeah, but Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Yeah. I'd recommend that one too. Very funny, and it's got some genuine scares in there too at the same time. So yeah, I'd recommend that one. Yeah, thanks for getting that one in there. I forgot about those.
Well, if you got anything else to add, then we will wrap up this week's show, and we hope you have a great Halloween. And I hope it's not too cold wherever you are. Stay warm. Hit smash like and subscribe. I got you.
Yeah.
And thank you for tuning in. Until next time. See you guys.
Take care, everybody.
See you guys.